Every Friday, the same black car stopped outside her flower shop. The same man in a dark suit stepped inside. The same dozen roses. No name, no small talk, no explanation. For 11 months, she never asked who he was. She only wrapped the flowers, took his money, and watched him disappear back into the city like he had never been there. Then one Friday, the car did not come. She waited past closing. She waited until the streetlights came on. Then she locked the door, sat on the floor behind the counter, and finally admitted the truth. She was not worried about the roses. She was terrified something had happened to him. And the worst part was, after 11 months of waiting for a stranger, she did not even know where to start looking. Some people enter your life so quietly, you do not realize they matter until they disappear. If you believe the most dangerous love stories begin without warning, subscribe now because this one starts with a flower shop, a missing man, and a black car that stopped coming. Sophia Benedetti had run her flower shop alone for 2 years, ever since her husband, Marco, passed away on a cold Tuesday in November and left her with a small building on a quiet street and a silence in the apartment above that she had never quite learned to fill. The shop was warm and lovely in the way that places are when someone pours their whole self into them. Hand-painted signs in the window, dried lavender hanging from the ceiling, a wooden counter worn smooth from years of elbows and conversation. Sophia was plus-size and unhurried, with hands that moved through stems and petals the way other people's hands moved through familiar music, certain and gentle without hesitation. She knew every regular customer by name and order. She thought she had seen everything a flower shop could show her. Then one Friday morning in January, a black car stopped outside her window at 8:55, 5 minutes before officially opened, and a man in a dark suit knocked on her glass door with one knuckle. Sophia almost did not answer. She was still in her apron, still filling the buckets. But something made her cross the floor and unlock the door, and she would spend the next 11 months trying to decide what that something was. He was tall and dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-40s with a face sharpened by time into something still and unreadable. He looked at the flowers for a long moment without speaking, then pointed to the white roses near the window and said simply, "Those, please," in a voice that was low and took up exactly as much space as it needed and no more. Sophia wrapped them without asking how many or for whom or whether he wanted a card. He paid without looking at the amount, left a tip too large for any bunch of flowers, said thank you, and walked back to the car. She stood holding the money for a moment before she put it in the register and went back to her buckets. He came back the following Friday. Same time, same white roses, same thank you. The third Friday, she had the roses already wrapped before he walked through the door, and she did not realize she had done it, until he paused for just a fraction of a second when she handed them across as though the gesture had surprised him. He said nothing about it, but she noticed that he looked at her a moment longer than the 2 Fridays before. Not with anything she could name, just with a quality of attention she was not entirely used to. She went back to work after he left and told herself it meant nothing. It was the first time she had ever found it necessary to tell herself that. By the 6th Friday, she knew his shoes, the exact shade of his coat, the way he always paused in the doorway 1 or 2 seconds before stepping fully inside, as though checking something. He never brought anyone with him. He never looked at his phone inside the shop, and the absence of it made the shop feel quieter when he was in it, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. She still did not know his name. She understood without thinking about it that asking would change something, and she was not ready for whatever that something was. 6 months in, she tucked a single stem of white freesia into his roses without charging him, and without explaining why. He looked at it when she handed the bunch across, then looked up at her, and something moved through his face so quickly she almost missed it. There and gone, replaced by his usual stillness. He said thank you the same way he always said it, and walked back to the car. That evening, she sat upstairs with her tea going cold beside her, and found herself wondering who he was taking the roses to every single week, and why always white, and why always a Friday, and why, out of every shop in this city, he had knocked on her door on a January morning when she was still in her apron and had not yet turned the sign. She never got the chance to ask because 4 weeks later, he stopped coming, and the person who walked into her shop that Friday afternoon instead was not the man in the dark suit. The person who came through her door that Friday afternoon was a young man, no older than 25, with the same dark hair and the same still quality of face that she recognized without having seen him before. He wore a simple dark jacket and carried himself with a carefulness that reminded her of someone trying hard not to show that something was wrong. He looked around the shop the way people look at a place they have heard described but never seen, taking in the lavender and the hand-painted signs, and then he looked at Sophia and said, "You are the flower lady." It was not a question. Sophia told him yes and stayed behind the counter. Something in his posture told her to give him a moment, the same instinct she had learned over 20 years of watching people come in carrying things they did not quite know how to put down. He reached into his jacket and took out a white envelope. He set it on the counter between them and stepped back slightly as though the envelope needed space of its own. He said his brother had asked him to bring it, that his brother had not been able to come himself, and that his brother had said she would know what it was about. Then he nodded once. The way people nod when they have delivered something that cost them something to carry, and he walked back out and got into the black car Sophia had not noticed was parked outside until that exact moment. She stood looking at the envelope for a long time before she touched it. Her name was on the front, just Sophia, in a handwriting that was careful and precise, the hand of someone who did not write often and had taken care this time. Inside was a single piece of notepaper, folded once. She opened it standing at the counter with the afternoon light coming through the window, because her hands were not steady enough yet to carry it to a chair and sit down with it properly the way the moment probably deserved. It said this: "I am sorry I was not there on Friday. I will explain when I am able to. The roses this week are already taken care of. Please do not worry." It was signed with a name she had never heard him say out loud, a name she had wondered about for 11 months, a name that landed in her chest with the particular weight of something that should have been said a long time ago. Nico. If you have ever waited for someone to tell you their name and realized only afterward how much it mattered, drop the words "I was waiting to" in the comments below right now, because Sophia had been waiting without knowing she was waiting, and this note had just made that impossible to pretend otherwise. She closed the shop early that afternoon for the first time in 2 years. She went upstairs, sat at her kitchen table, and read the note 3 more times. Not because she did not understand it, but because she wanted it to say more than it did. The roses this week are already taken care of. She had not thought to wonder how until she looked out the back window and saw it. On the small stone ledge where the morning light hit first was a bunch of white roses wrapped in the same brown paper he always used, tied with the same dark twine, placed there before she opened, so she would find them without knowing when they arrived. She brought them inside and put them in water and stood looking at them. She thought about a man hurt badly enough that he could not come himself but who had still found a way to make sure the roses arrived. She thought about the careful handwriting. She thought about his brother nodding once before he left, as though the errand had cost him something. She thought about 11 months of white roses, and a name she had only just learned, and had already said to herself 3 times since reading it, and she understood with a quiet certainty that was not comfortable, but was absolutely clear, that she was not the kind of woman who waited when she already knew what she needed to do. She picked up the note and turned it over. On the back, in the same careful hand, was something she had not noticed. The first 3 times she read it, a phone number. No instruction, no explanation, just the number at the bottom of the page, as though it had almost not been included at all, as though it had been added at the very last moment, by someone who was not entirely sure they were brave enough to leave it. Sophia did not call that evening. She set the note on the kitchen table with the number facing up, made herself a cup of tea she did not drink, and sat with it until the room went dark around her. She had not been the kind of woman who called men she did not know since she was young, and 11 months of Friday mornings did not change the fact that she did not actually know this man. She only knew his coat and his shoes and the way he paused in her doorway, which was, she told herself firmly, not the same thing as knowing someone. She went to bed without calling. She lay awake for 2 hours. She got up at midnight and picked up her phone and put it back down. She got up again at midnight, and this time she did not put it back down. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low and unhurried, but there was something underneath it that had not been there on Friday mornings in her shop. A thinness, the sound of someone speaking carefully, because speaking without care was currently beyond them. He said her name and she said his, Nico, the first time she had said it out loud. And the small silence between them was different from all their other silences because this one they were both fully aware of. She asked if he was all right. He said he had been better. She asked if there was anything she could do, which she had not planned to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could come on Friday if you wanted to," just because Friday was when she usually came. She wrote the address on the back of an old receipt and read it back to him twice. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. She stood in her kitchen at 12:40 the morning holding that receipt and understood that something had shifted between the beginning of that phone call and the end of it. Something quiet and permanent she could not undo and did not want to. Friday came preceded by a week that moved both too slowly and too quickly. She told herself several times that she was simply checking on a customer. She had brought soup to an elderly regular when he broke his hip. She had driven a young mother home once when the woman's car would not start. Checking on a customer was a normal thing, a person who ran a small flower shop did sometimes. She had almost convinced herself of this by Thursday evening. Then she cut a fresh bunch of white roses and stood holding them over the wrapping paper and understood she was not bringing them for a customer. She wrapped them anyway. She tied them with the dark twine. She drove to the address on Friday morning and found a building larger and quieter and more heavily staffed at its entrance than she had expected. The two men at the front door looked at her, then at the roses, then let her through without a word. And that small exchange told her something about the man upstairs that she had half known for a while and had been choosing not to examine too closely. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and knocked on the door at the end of the corridor and waited. He opened the door himself in a dark sweater, instead of his suit moving with a careful stillness that told her exactly where the injury was without her needing to ask. He looked at her, and then at the roses, and something happened to his face that she had glimpsed only once before that brief unguarded thing from the morning. She put the freesia in his bunch, except this time it stayed a little longer before he recovered himself. He stepped back to let her in. She walked in and he closed the door and they stood in the entrance hallway in the particular awkwardness of two people who had never been in the same room without a counter between them. She held out the roses. He took them. He said they were for his wife. The room rearranged itself around that sentence and she did not quite know what to do with her face. He saw her expression and said quietly, "My wife passed away 14 months ago." He said it the way people say things they have said enough times that the words no longer break them the way they once did. But you could still hear clearly where the break had been. She had been selling him roses to take to a grave every Friday for 11 months, and he had come back every single week. Not just for the roses. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The apartment was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something true has just been said and the air has not settled back around it. Sophia looked at this man she had watched from across a wooden counter for almost a year and understood she had two choices. She could say something careful and polite and retreat, or she could stay. She had driven across the city on a Friday morning with white roses and a feeling she could not argue against clearly enough to ignore. She stayed. She asked if he wanted her to put the roses in water. She found a glass in his kitchen because a man living alone in grief rarely owned a vase. And when she came back, he was sitting by the window looking up at her the way people look at something they were not sure they were allowed to want. He told her about his wife. Her name was Julia. She had been warm and funny and entirely unafraid of him, which he said with a quiet emphasis that told Sophia this was rare in his world. She died of an illness that moved quickly and gave no warning. He had handled everything after efficiently and alone until one Friday he found himself parked outside a flower shop on a street he did not usually drive down. He had needed white roses, and there were white roses in the window. He said all of this looking mostly at the floor, and Sophia listened the way she listened to everything, without rushing him toward a conclusion he had not reached yet. She told him about Marco. She had not planned to. She had not talked about Marco to anyone new in 2 years, not the way she talked about him now. She talked about the way he burned toast every morning without ever learning to watch it, and the particular silence of the apartment after he was gone. The kind of silence that is not peaceful but is the shape of a person no longer there. Nico listened without looking away, and she understood as she was talking that she had been very lonely for 2 years and had not let herself know it until now. When she stood to leave, the afternoon had gone entirely. He walked her to the door. They stood in the hallway the same way they had at the beginning, except the awkwardness was gone, replaced by something warmer and less certain and considerably more complicated. He said he would like to come to the shop on Friday if that was all right. She said it was. He said he was sorry he had not told her his name sooner. She said she was sorry she had not asked. They stood one more moment in the way of two people who have said everything they needed to say and are not quite ready for the silence after. If you have ever met someone who arrived at exactly the right moment, wearing exactly the wrong timing, drop the words, "Me too," in the comments right now, because Nico and Sophia were not looking for anyone and found each other anyway, and what happens next is the part of the story that stays with you. He came the following Friday and the Friday after that. The black car stopped at 8:55, the same as always, But now she knew his name when she heard the knock, and she opened the door before he finished knocking, and he noticed that she did, and neither of them said anything about it, because they did not need to. She had taken to cutting his roses Thursday evenings, now letting them open slightly overnight, so they were at their best when he arrived, and this was the kind of small private thing people do when they have begun to care about something, without having announced it to anyone, including themselves. He told her what he was one afternoon in early spring, sitting at her wooden counter with coffee she had begun keeping in the back for Friday mornings. He did not make it dramatic. He told her plainly and without decoration, and then waited. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she had suspected something along those lines, since the two men at his front door looked at her roses and let her through without a word. He looked at her. She picked up his empty cup and asked if he wanted more coffee, which was the clearest answer she could give him, and they both knew it. The white roses still went to Julia every Friday. That never changed. Sophia never asked him to stop. But somewhere between that cold January night and the spring that followed, a second bouquet began appearing on her counter every week. No note, no explanation, just white roses, tied with dark twine, left in the handwriting she now knew by heart. For 11 months, he had walked into her shop like a stranger. One midnight phone call changed everything. And Sophia finally understood that some people do not enter your life loudly. They arrive quietly, one Friday at a time, until the day they are gone and you realize they already belong there. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe before you leave. More quiet, dangerous, unforgettable love stories are coming, and you will want to be here when the next one begins.